On May 2, 1945, Berlin stopped fighting. The city was defeated, occupied, and reduced to ruins. Among the collapsed streets, there was no longer organized army nor standing government. What followed was not war, it was life after it. The Third Reich's capital became a place without direction. Millions of people were trapped in a scenario of hunger, dispossession, and military control. Neighborhoods were corridors of rubble, shelters were transformed into improvised hostels, and squares were used as rationing points. There was no possible normality, only strict orders and minimal survival under Soviet surveillance. How did one live day to day in a destroyed city? What price did Berliners pay to survive among ruins and occupation? In what way did Berlin begin a new life after its total defeat? Berlin's apocalypse, the Reich's last battle. On April 20, 1945, Soviet forces completed Berlin's encirclement. Operation Berlin deployed more than 2.5 million soldiers, backed by more than 6,200 tanks, more than 41,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 7,500 aircraft. The concentration of force on the German capital exceeded any precedent in previous urban combat. From outer positions, Soviet artillery maintained continuous bombardment. For 12 consecutive days, the city was subjected to constant fire that irreversibly altered its urban structure. Projectiles converted entire streets into rubble corridors and left complete neighborhoods reduced to ruins. Systematic advance increasingly pressured Berlin's political and military nucleus, progressively reducing organized defense capacity. German forces responded with a heterogeneous defensive structure. Wehrmacht units remained, Waffen-SS detachments, Volkssturm formations composed of elderly men and adolescents, plus Hitlerjugend contingents. Most lacked adequate military training and sufficient resources. Available armament was outdated and in insufficient quantities. The disadvantage against an offensive superior in number, coordination, and war material became evident from the first days of combat. It is calculated that between April 20 and May, around 2 million projectiles were launched on the city. The effect was devastating. Demolished buildings, main avenues transformed into improvised trenches, and residential areas converted into crossfire fields. Anti-aircraft shelters, initially destined to protect the population, were destroyed or collapsed. Smoke, dust, and fires reduced visibility and plunged combatants and civilians into an environment of permanent confusion. The Reichstag, symbol of German political power, received direct impacts from heavy artillery for several days. Although it managed to remain partially standing, its walls were reduced to smoking structures and twisted steel beams. Its capture, occurring on April 30th, constituted a milestone in the offensive, as it represented the physical demolition of the regime's political center. However, combat continued in various city sectors until the last moments. German supply lines, already deteriorated since previous weeks, collapsed definitively during the battle. The few supplies that arrived did so sporadically, and military reserves were exhausted in the first days of intense combat. The lack of ammunition, drinking water, and basic provisions became evident in the last days, affecting both combatants and civilians trapped in neighborhoods punished by artillery. On April 30th, around midday, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. This fact did not immediately stop confrontations, but eliminated any possibility of centralized coordination. High Command attempted to reorganize defenses, though it lacked real means to sustain them. Attempts to negotiate partial surrender proved fruitless as the Red Army demanded unconditional capitulation. The German chain of command fragmented, and communications were interrupted to such a point that messengers did not reach their destinations and orders lost coherence before reaching units. In the last hours of April and first days of May, red flags began to wave over government buildings and tall structures in the city center. German resistance was reduced to small, isolated groups without coordination or defined objectives. Each stronghold operated independently, while the Soviet offensive advanced without significant obstacles. On May 2nd at midday, German General Helmut Weidling signed the unconditional surrender of all forces in Berlin. A structured army no longer existed, but scattered groups surrounded by Soviet units. At 3 in the afternoon of that same day, weapons officially fell silent. Soviet delegates and German representatives formalized total capitulation at an agreed point within the city. The silence that followed the cessation of combat revealed the state in which the capital had remained. Smoke began to dissipate, revealing streets reduced to piles of rubble, collapsed facades and unremoved bodies. Air carried grey dust and metallic residues, sign of the intensity of the recently concluded battle. The urban landscape had changed irreversibly. Central streets like Alexanderstrasse and Unter den Linden disappeared as passable axes and transformed into ruin corridors. Streetcars had stopped functioning days before, with twisted rails and destroyed cars. The few automobiles that remained were found crushed and abandoned among the debris. Urban infrastructure was rendered useless. Electric stations appeared as metallic structures without operational cables. Water and sewage networks were collapsed. There was no gas or electricity in operation. The basic services system had ceased to exist. In the city centre, where the most intense bombardments concentrated, residential buildings had been reduced to piles of bricks and twisted beams. Government towers showed sunken roofs and torn terraces. What, until a few years before, had been prestigious apartments had become unrecognizable ruins. No organized civil activity was observed. There was no commerce, nor transport, nor visible attempts at re-establishment. Urban life disappeared abruptly. The days following the ceasefire showed an immobile city, without resistance, without administration, and without signs of immediate reconstruction. The Third Reich's political heart had passed into Soviet hands, but no replacement authority had yet been installed. The city remained suspended between a recently destroyed past and a future that had not yet begun to take shape. Administrative Zero Hour, Berzarin's Mandate. On May 2, 1945, Berlin had formally capitulated. However, the cessation of combat did not imply automatic re-establishment of urban life. The city lacked government structures, and its political and administrative institutions had been destroyed or completely disarticulated. The power vacuum was immediately filled by the Red Army, which assumed absolute control of the German capital. Direct responsibility for organizing the new administration fell to General Nikolai Erastovich Berzarin, commander of the Soviet Fifth Shock Army. On May 3rd, he officially received authority over Berlin, and his first task consisted of imposing minimal order in a devastated territory, with millions of inhabitants without administrative direction. Berzarin's first step was to dissolve all German political institutions that still remained. The remnants of the National Socialist Party, associations linked to the regime and local committees were eliminated without exception. No German organism could act autonomously. All initiative remained under exclusive authorization of Soviet military command. The objective was to prevent both reorganization of National Socialist networks and the appearance of independent structures outside control. The measure also reached police forces and civil defense associations, which were disarmed and dissolved in the first days after capitulation. German officials who had remained in service during combat were dismissed without consideration of their level of involvement with the previous regime. Simultaneously, the confiscation of weapons, radio communication equipment, vehicles and photographic cameras in civilian hands was ordered. The prohibition extended to domestic radio receivers with the purpose of ensuring Soviet monopoly of communications and transport. With initial security guaranteed, Berzarin's staff established a hierarchy of priorities. The first was food supply. Available reserves in military warehouses and abandoned depots were distributed through collective kitchens and improvised delivery points in streets and squares. Although insufficient, these measures avoided total vacuum in the first days after surrender. Secondly, health assistance was prioritized. Berlin was saturated with wounded and sick, weakened after months of privations. Soviet command ordered reopening hospitals that could still function even if in precarious conditions. Medicines and medical material were confiscated in military depots and redistributed in these installations. All German health personnel were obligatorily mobilized to attend to the population under Soviet supervision. The third step was provisional accommodation of refugees and displaced persons. Command ordered registering standing buildings and enabling damaged schools, empty warehouses and public halls as improvised shelters. These solutions were temporary, but offered minimal refuge to those who lacked housing. Debris clearing in main arteries constituted the next priority. Cleaning brigades integrated by civilians, supervised by Soviet soldiers, were organized. With manual tools, corridors were opened that allowed passage of military and basic transport vehicles. In parallel, limited restoration of essential services was arranged. Soviet engineers and German technicians worked together in repairing water pumps and electric generators. In some neighborhoods, reduced supply of water and electricity was re-established, with priority for hospitals and strategic areas. Soviet administration established a central military government headquarters in Berlin, with departments responsible for security, supply, health, housing, and transport. Each neighborhood remained under supervision of a Soviet representative, although Germans were incorporated in minor functions of registration and distribution. A key measure was implementation of ration cards. From May, it was announced that food would be distributed according to labor and social categories, with priority for essential workers and seriously ill. This system would remain in effect during the following years. Limitations were evident. Healthcare proved insufficient. Improvised shelters could not absorb all refugees, and debris clearing advanced slowly due to lack of machinery. Re-establishment of basic services reached only part of the city. Despite this, initial provisions allowed avoiding complete authority vacuum. Rigorous curfews and strict transit controls were imposed. Civilians had to carry documents at all times, which also facilitated their mobilization toward cleaning and repair tasks. Discipline was applied through direct orders and constant military surveillance. May 1945 thus represented Berlin's transition from a city devastated by war toward a territory under strict occupation. Foundations of Soviet administration were immediately installed, though population needs far exceeded available resources. What was established in those first weeks did not constitute definitive solution, but barely the beginning of a system of military control and minimal reconstruction. Hunger and rations, the city that survived with the minimum. After establishment of Soviet administration in Berlin in the first days of May 1945, the central problem for the population was food supply. The city had endured weeks of siege and constant bombardment, and its food reserves were practically non-existent. Railway, road, and river transport systems were damaged or collapsed, which hindered arrival of external supplies. In that scenario, the Red Army established food control based on ration cards, field kitchens, and utilization of captured depots. Ration cards became the essential instrument to distribute available food. They were organized in differentiated categories according to labor activity and social condition of recipients. The highest corresponded to workers who performed heavy physical labor or were considered indispensable for reconstruction, such as workers in basic factories, railway workers, cleaning brigades, and health personnel. Intermediate categories included office employees and officials. The lowest were reserved for elderly, children, and persons without formal labor activity. In theory, cards fixed weekly quantities of bread, meat, fats, sugar, and other products. In practice, these assignments were rarely fulfilled. Generalized scarcity and transport problems caused constant delays and drastic reductions in deliveries. Frequently, what was distributed was much less than officially announced. Bread, diet base, was usually made with mixtures of potato flour, bran, or other low nutritional value substitutes. Meat and fats were almost non-existent in regular distribution, except in small sporadic distributions. Sugar and coffee were largely reserved for hospitals or for exclusive consumption of occupation troops. Field kitchens installed by the Red Army complemented the system. At various strategic points, mobile kitchens were set up that distributed basic soups, porridge, and hot rations in exchange for vouchers issued by military authority. These kitchens fulfilled a double function, feeding the most deprived sectors and maintaining control over food flow in neighborhoods especially punished. However, their reach was very limited. Demand far exceeded production capacity, and queues were long and disorderly. For many inhabitants, those watery soups with vegetables or meat in minimal proportion represented the only hot meal for several days. In that context of structural insufficiency arose a phenomenon that soon became daily: Fringsen. The term, which later would be associated with Cologne Bishop Joseph Frings, was already used in summer 1945 to describe appropriation of food, coal, or basic materials in abandoned warehouses, damaged cars, or destroyed installations, under justification of survival necessity. In Berlin, families toured ruins and stations in search of grain remains, forgotten cans, or any edible product. It was not violent looting, but a practice tolerated insofar as authorities could not watch all scattered depots. In parallel, black market consolidated as the main complementary supply channel. Rigidity and insufficiency of rationing pushed the population to a clandestine barter system. Exchanges were carried out in cleared squares, partially clean central streets and surroundings of reopened stations. Money lost almost all value and was replaced by personal exchange objects. Watches, jewelry, musical instruments, quality clothing and artworks were offered in exchange for bread, lard, canned meat or cigarettes. Allied soldiers, mainly Soviet but also from other forces that arrived later, contributed products from their own military supplies, becoming important actors of this market. The gap between nominal rations and what was actually delivered was wide. While administrative records spoke of hundreds of weekly grams of bread and small protein portions, in practice, most subsisted with much smaller quantities and inferior quality. This difference forced recourse to black market or Fringsen as inevitable complement. Thus, the official system coexisted with a parallel framework indispensable for survival. Railway transport played a critical role in supply, though it functioned very precariously. Main lines were damaged by bombing and numerous bridges had been destroyed. Even so, from June suburban trains and some freight convoys began to circulate. They transported flour, potatoes, canned vegetables and coal toward the capital. Capacity was reduced and delays frequent, but they represented the only massive entry route for food. Partial re-establishment of streetcars and some trucks helped distribute loads, though serious bottlenecks persisted. Between May and September 1945, bread remained as absolute diet base. It was dark, dense, and of limited flavor, with low nutritional value. Potatoes arrived in reduced quantities and were destined mainly to hospitals and collective kitchens. Fats practically disappeared from common diet. Meat was extremely scarce and fish barely appeared. Coffee disappeared completely and was substituted by chicory or toasted barley substitutes. Tea almost did not exist and hot drinks were reduced to herb infusions collected in parks. Malnutrition spread visibly. Medical reports from Soviet administration and First International missions pointed out generalized weight loss, especially among children and elderly. On streets it was common to see weakened persons, fainting in distribution queues and collapse episodes from food insufficiency. It was not specific epidemics, but chronic caloric and protein deficiency that weakened the population as a whole and increased vulnerability to diseases. 3 parallel circuits configured urban economy in those months: official rationing, field kitchens, and black market. None alone could sustain the population. Survival depended on combination of the 3. Those who had no valuable objects remained limited to the official system, which placed them in critical conditions. In contrast, those who could trade in black market managed to complement their diet, creating notable inequalities in feeding possibilities. Urban agriculture appeared as additional resource, though of reduced scope. Berliners were encouraged to plant quick-cycle vegetables in empty lots, destroyed parks and interior courtyards. Turnips, carrots, cabbages and lettuces grew in improvised plots. Although production was minimal, it helped diversify diet in summer months. Soviet control over black market was irregular. Sometimes raids were conducted on visible or large-scale exchanges, but in most cases it was tolerated, conscious that the official system could not by itself sustain the population. Strict repression would have aggravated general misery. Therefore, authorities applied intervention selectively, using it more as political control tool than economic policy. In summer 1945, daily life in Berlin was structured around endless queues, collective kitchens, improvised barters, and urban gardens in ruins. Hunger was the dominant element of daily existence, and available solutions failed to cover minimum needs. The city lived a period of economic and food twilight, without immediate improvement prospects, while Soviet occupation sought to consolidate its control amid a panorama of generalized scarcity. Looting and violence, the law of chaos in Berlin. The Red Army's entry into Berlin meant not only military occupation, but also the appearance of multiple forms of violence against civilian population. From the first days after capitulation, looting, Sexual aggressions and criminal acts committed by individuals or groups under cover of absence of authority were recorded. The period between May and summer 1945 was characterized by diffuse violence, tolerated in many cases by Soviet command and repressed only irregularly. Looting was one of the initial expressions of this violence. It manifested at different levels. Organized military looting had tacit or explicit authorization from Soviet units to send to the Soviet Union goods considered war booty. Official quotas of up to 5 kilograms per soldier were established, which incentivized confiscation of watches, clothing, household utensils, electrical appliances, and valuable objects. These shipments were made through military transport with administrative documentation and convoys specifically destined to transfer goods toward Soviet territory. Spontaneous looting involved individual soldiers who burst into homes, businesses, and warehouses, taking clothing, food, or alcohol. Even when dwellings were destroyed or abandoned, violent break-ins occurred in presence of families. Broken down doors, destroyed furniture, and inhabitants forced to surrender belongings under weapon threats were documented. Secondary civilian looting took place after troop withdrawal from certain areas. German population took advantage of authority absence to appropriate goods in businesses, depots, and empty homes. At this level, violence was lesser, with appropriation of abandoned resources predominating. Looting patterns varied according to neighborhoods. In the center, in sectors like Mitte, Tiergarten, and Charlottenburg, the main objective was luxury objects: artworks, musical instruments, typewriters, jewelry, and quality watches. In working neighborhoods like Lichtenberg and wedding interest concentrated on clothing, kitchen utensils, and stored alcohol. Intensity was greater in the first days of occupation, progressively decreasing toward July 1945, when disciplinary measures began to be imposed in certain sectors. Sexual violence was an extended phenomenon. Estimates about victim numbers vary widely, from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Patterns were consistent. Soviet soldiers entered homes, basements, or shelters and imposed aggressions individually or collectively. Cases were recorded in all age ranges, from adolescents to elderly women, including hospitalized and pregnant. Medical reports from May and June 1945 pointed out sharp increase in sexually transmitted infections, forced pregnancies, and complications derived from abortions practiced in precarious conditions. Sexual violence was sometimes accompanied by beatings, weapon threats, and property destruction. Some medical testimonies collected cases of victims who had suffered repeated aggressions during consecutive days. Numerous suicides related to these situations were also documented, with hospital records of intoxications, hangings, and self-inflicted injuries. Eastern and northeastern neighborhoods like Friedrichshain, Lichtenberg, and Pankow recorded highest figures in the first days. Subsequently, violence extended towards center and west, though in areas where presence of superior Soviet commands was more visible. Like Reichstag surroundings, relatively greater control was applied. In peripheral sectors, with less supervision from high-ranking officers, impunity was maintained for months. Alongside looting and sexual aggressions, other forms of criminality proliferated. Violent robberies were committed by civilians who still had light weapons. Although immediate confiscation of armament had been ordered, many rifles and pistols remained in circulation. Extortion appeared in the form of goods demands in exchange for temporary protection. In some neighborhoods, small organized groups claimed food or belongings under direct threats. There were also individual reprisals against persons linked to the National Socialist Party or previous administration. These included spontaneous lynchings and summary executions. Transit places like railway stations in reopening process and improvised markets became foci of robberies and aggressions. Even food distribution points were seen of crimes due to concentration of people. Red Army High Command was aware of excesses, but their initial reaction was ambivalent. Between May and June, implicit tolerance predominated, based on the idea that soldiers had right to revenge for years of German occupation in Soviet territory. This vision was mentioned in internal meetings and in later testimonies of Soviet commands. It was assumed that troops who had endured German devastations could act with certain freedom. When violence began to put administrative stability at risk, gradual disciplinary measures were introduced. Military patrols were organized in some neighborhoods, and arrests of soldiers involved in flagrant looting or sexual aggressions with present witnesses were made. Soviet military tribunals processed a limited number of cases with sentences that included forced transfers to combat units or summary executions. However, application was irregular and depended on each commander's initiative. In neighborhoods with stronger presence of superior commands, discipline was stricter and violence diminished. In peripheral sectors with less supervision, impunity continued. Berlin East hospitals recorded admissions of women with serious internal injuries and complications derived from sexual aggressions. Reports mentioned multiple rapes and abortions practiced in precarious conditions that resulted in infections and hemorrhages. Looting complaints were presented in some neighborhoods to local authorities, though they often received no response. In Charlottenburg, disappearance of watches, bicycles, and sewing machines was documented. In Prenzlauer Berg, collective rapes in basements and shelters during the first 2 weeks of May were reported. In Friedrichshain, there were fires caused in looted homes that forced internal displacements. Criminality was not exclusive to Soviet soldiers. In Western neighborhoods before arrival of British and Americans, robberies and aggressions committed by German civilians armed with military equipment remains were recorded. This evidenced that authority vacuum generated an environment of generalized violence with multiple actors. Towards summer 1945, looting and sexual aggressions diminished in intensity, though they did not disappear. Progressive establishment of more organized administration, arrival of Western Allied authorities to their sectors, and beginning of rudimentary German police under supervision contributed to partially reducing most visible crimes. Nevertheless, trace of those initial months remained marked in city daily life, configuring an environment in which military control coexisted with latent insecurity that had not yet dissipated. Corpses and graves, the hidden plague among ruins. At the end of Berlin battle, the city was saturated with corpses. Between April 20 and May 2, 1945, more than 20,000 civilians and tens of thousands of soldiers died, both German and Soviet. Most bodies remained lying in streets, collapsed basements, or under rubble mountains. Immediate priority after surrender was to remove them, both for hygiene reasons and to prevent massive decomposition in a densely populated environment. Soviet command arranged from the first days of May strict separation of civilian and military bodies. Red Army soldiers received burials in improvised cemeteries marked with stakes and red flags, while German bodies were deposited in differentiated common graves. Civilians were buried in destroyed parks, empty lots and esplanades without complete records. In districts like Treptow and Weissensee, trenches were dug that received dozens of bodies each day. Work was performed by German prisoner of war brigades and neighbors forced under military supervision. In sectors like Charlottenburg, corpses were transported in improvised wheelbarrows and temporarily deposited in school courtyards before being transferred to definitive graves. Pace was insufficient faced with problem magnitude. Weeks after battle end, bodies could still be seen in secondary streets and under collapsed buildings. Lack of machinery forced dependence on manual work, which slowed cleaning. Difference in treatment of dead also responded to propaganda motives. Provisional Soviet cemeteries were maintained with crosses or stelae that identified fallen, while German graves usually lacked signalization. This later complicated family location and any repatriation attempt. Permanence of corpses in urban spaces generated serious environmental crisis. Stench was perceptible throughout the city for weeks. Well and pipeline water was contaminated by filtrations from superficially buried bodies. In flooded basements, hundreds of corpses remained in advanced putrefaction state, impossible to remove immediately. Decomposition in closed spaces favored massive proliferation of rats, flies, and other disease vectors, especially in neighborhoods like Wedding and Prenzlauer Berg. Between May and summer 1945, common graves were excavated at numerous city points. Parks like Volkspark Friedrichshain, esplanades in Pankow and Lichtenberg lands were used to bury hundreds of bodies. Trenches were 2 or 3 meters deep, and corpses were arranged aligned or piled, covered with lime when available. Absence of coffins forced burial without packaging. which accelerated filtrations towards subsoil and contaminated nearby water sources. Attempts to register names and belongings were fragmentary. In many cases, bodies were inhumed without identification, with numbered wooden tablets or without any mark. Municipal reports from August estimated tens of thousands of already buried corpses, though under rubble thousands more remained, recovered only months later with adequate machinery help. Sanitary situation deteriorated rapidly. Overcrowding in shelters, lack of drinking water and exposure to decomposing corpses created ideal conditions for epidemics. Typhus, transmitted by lice in precarious hygiene contexts, registered outbreaks in June and July, especially in neighborhoods with basements saturated with bodies. Dysentery, caused by water contamination with human and animal remains, provoked dozens of daily admissions in hospitals for severe infectious diarrhea. Cholera appeared in isolated foci toward end of summer, on smaller scale than other infections, but sufficient to increase alarm among already weakened population. German doctors lacked means to diagnose and treat effectively. Epidemic outbreaks continued until autumn with high mortality, particularly among children and elderly. Berlin hospital system was collapsed since April. Many hospitals had been destroyed, and those that remained operative lacked electricity, running water and medicines. Operating rooms functioned in improvised conditions, often illuminated with candles or oil lamps. In hospitals like Charité, patients exceeded by 4 or 5 times normal capacity. Attending combat wounded civilians with traumas and sick with intestinal infections, antibiotic scarcity was almost absolute. Minimal quantities of sulfonamides existed but proved insufficient. Analgesics and sanitary material were so scarce they had to be reused, increasing hospital infection risk. Nurses improvised rehydration serums with boiled water and salt when fuel was available. Hospital mortality was high, especially in typhus and dysentery cases. Soviet supplies were destined primarily to troops, with only marginal quantities for civilian hospitals. From August, international Red Cross contributions and Allied aid organizations arrived, which partially alleviated crisis, though basic medicine scarcity continued until well into autumn. Doctors insisted on urgent need for chlorine to disinfect water, soap for hygiene and antibiotics. Soviet response focused mainly on preventing epidemics from reaching their own units. Result of this combination of exposed corpses, improvised graves, contaminated water, epidemics and overwhelmed hospitals was significant civilian mortality in months after battle. Records, though incomplete, show thousands of Berliners died in summer 1945, not from direct war wounds but from infectious diseases and malnutrition aggravated by sanitary crisis. In many neighborhoods, population attempted rudimentary self-protection measures, boiling water when fuel existed, covering contaminated wells or filtering liquids with vegetable charcoal. Without access to basic medicines or stable fuel, these resources were insufficient. Berlin was trapped in sanitary crisis that prolonged civilian suffering long after combat end. Physical reconstruction, women among rubble and steel. After Soviet administration installation in May 1945, Berlin faced critical material situation that exceeded mere war destruction. More than 4/5 of its infrastructure was damaged or destroyed, 2/3 of dwellings were uninhabitable, and transport system barely functioned rudimentarily. Recovery of minimal habitability conditions became priority task both for occupation authorities and surviving civilian population. Between 1945 and 1947, efforts concentrated on 3 fundamental areas: rubble clearing, gradual reopening of transport and basic services, and search for solutions to housing problem that affected most of population. Estimates made in summer 1945 calculated more than 75 million cubic meters of rubble accumulated in streets, squares, and lots. Partially or totally destroyed buildings had converted the city into ruins labyrinth that impeded vehicle transit, hindered water and electricity supply, and obstructed even pedestrian circulation. Main street clearing began in June 1945 through civilian brigades organized by neighborhoods and supervised by Soviet authorities. Available machinery was minimal, so most work was performed with manual tools, shovels, picks, and improvised wheelbarrows. Removed rubble accumulated in artificial mountains, some of which remained for decades as testimony of years of reconstruction work. Cleaning priorities were established with functional criteria. Transport axes like Alexanderplatz, Unter den Linden and Leipziger Straße received priority attention to allow streetcar and supply truck movement. Immediate areas of reopened hospitals and administrative buildings in use were second objective. Bridges over Spree River were considered indispensable to connect neighborhoods separated by water. Male labor force was scarce due to high number of prisoners of war, dead and seriously wounded, which led to massive women participation in these tasks. Work was obligatory and organized through neighborhood lists, with continuous shifts under military supervision. Transport system had collapsed in May 1945. Streetcars and suburban trains were inoperative due to destroyed tracks, demolished bridges, and damaged rolling stock. Service reopening was performed gradually following military administration priorities. In June of that year, first streetcar sections were enabled in eastern districts like Lichtenberg and Weißensee. Cars circulated with improvised repairs, frequently without windows and with rudimentary seats. In July, partial suburban train services were re-established with limited convoys between peripheral areas to transport workers to factories resuming minimal activity. Schedules were irregular and depended on fuel and constant repairs. At end of that same year, routes towards center were enabled, which facilitated mobility toward improvised markets and cleaning brigades, though service continued being limited and subject to frequent interruptions. Bridges over Spree and its canals were immediate priority. Many had been demolished during German retreat, cutting essential connections. Soviet and German engineers installed provisional bridges with wood and recovered metallic structures. These allowed re-establishing minimal connections during summer, while more permanent repairs only advanced from 1946 with arrival of Western power resources in their respective sectors. Water and electricity supply repair accompanied transport reopening. In June 1945, underground pumps were reactivated, though with limited service to few hours daily in selected sectors. Electricity proved even more difficult to re-establish, as power plants were seriously damaged. In some neighborhoods, there was only current for some hours, with priority for hospitals and administrative offices. In 1946, provisional transformers were installed that partially expanded service, though it continued being restricted for years. Housing problem was one of most serious crises. Of 245,000 existing dwellings before war, approximately 80,000 had been completely destroyed, and more than 120,000 were seriously damaged. Only one-third was minimally habitable, and many lacked window glass, complete roofs, or heating. Soviet authorities and later inter-Allied administration applied forced reassignment policy. Several families were installed in same apartment, dividing spaces through improvised partitions or curtains. In some cases, 3 or 4 families shared kitchen and common areas. Displaced persons who continued arriving from other regions increased pressure on housing space. To alleviate shortage, collective shelters were organized in partially destroyed schools, unused factories, and empty administrative buildings. Conditions were precarious: severe overcrowding, lack of heating, and absence of privacy. Many refugees remained there for years until reconstruction advanced. Winter from 1945 to 1946 was particularly severe. Coal shortage and heating system destruction forced improvising indoor ovens using furniture and wood remains as fuel. This caused accidental fires and carbon monoxide poisoning cases. During 1946, priority was repairing roofs and windows to reduce cold and humidity exposure. Progress was slow due to material scarcity and specialized worker shortage. With majority of adult men dead, wounded, or prisoners, responsibility for rubble clearing fell on women between 15 and 60 years old, known as Trümmerfrauen, literally rubble women. Recruited through obligatory neighborhood listings under Soviet supervision, they were assigned to work crews. Their tasks included unstable wall demolition, manual brick classification for reuse, rubble transport in wheelbarrows, and systematic cleaning of streets and courtyards. Work was exhausting and performed with rudimentary tools. Payment was symbolic, generally additional food rations or small coal quantities. In 1946, it was calculated that more than 60,000 women regularly participated in these brigades. Their labor allowed recovering millions of bricks and materials reused in provisional dwelling construction and in school and hospital repairs. Rubble mountains accumulated in places like future Teufelsberg are a direct result of this systematic work of years. Material reconstruction between 1945 and 1947 was limited. Immediate objective was not restoring city to its previous state, but achieving minimal conditions for survival: passable streets, partial public transport, drinking water in some neighborhoods, electricity restricted to essential sectors, and repaired roofs in damaged dwellings. Soviet military administration reports from end of 1946 pointed out that majority of Berliners continued living in damaged spaces, with improvised divisions between families and without adequate heating. Public transport, though partially resumed, suffered interruptions due to lack of spare parts and fuel. Electric supply covered less than half of real demand. Even with these limitations, collective effort allowed the city not to remain completely paralyzed. Trümmerfrauen work cleared main arteries, transport reconnected isolated neighborhoods, and thousands of families found temporary shelter in urgently repaired buildings. Reconstruction was not resolved, but Berlin had taken first steps to sustain daily life in prolonged precariousness scenario. From purging to division, the city split in two. Period between 1946 and 1949 marked Berlin's and Germany's transition from military defeat toward new political and institutional configuration. Denazification applied unequally by occupying powers, creation of Allied Control Council, Potsdam Conference decisions, and growing frictions among powers resulted in functional separation of occupation zones and definition of special status for the city. Denazification was conceived as a systematic process to eliminate all National Socialist Party influence from public life. Allied Control Council established 5 categories: major culprits, which included high party and state leaders, as well as those responsible for war crimes, incriminated among them intermediate cadres and SS officers; lesser culprits linked to secondary positions, sympathizers, affiliates without relevant functions, and exonerated citizens free of suspicion. Application varied according to zones. In Soviet zone, it was implemented quickly and radically, with dismissal of practically all officials linked to previous regime, from judges to teachers and police. In zones controlled by United States, United Kingdom, and France, process was more gradual and pragmatic, as shortage of qualified personnel forced reintegrating individuals classified as lesser culprits or sympathizers in indispensable technical positions. In Western zones, denazification was applied through special tribunals called Spruchkammern, which evaluated forms called Fragebogen that all adults had to complete with detail about their political, labor, and military trajectory. In Berlin, dismissal of thousands of public officials in 1946 caused critical personnel shortage in essential sectors like education and justice. Many were substituted by persons with insufficient training, considered, however, politically trustworthy. Toward 1948, some previously removed professionals were reintegrated. Allied Control Council, created in June 1945 with headquarters in Berlin, was composed of representatives from United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and from end of that same year, France. Each military commander possessed veto right, which converted the organism into permanent and often blocked negotiation space. It issued directives on Germany's complete demilitarization, Nazi party dissolution, and strategic industries control. It also had to coordinate common administration of railway transport, foreign trade, and war reparations. In practice, Council was losing effectiveness. Between 1946 and 1947, ideological and strategic differences between Soviets and Westerners paralyzed many of its decisions. Finally, in March 1948, Soviet delegation withdrew, which meant practical breakdown of organism and end of joint administration. Potsdam Conference, held in summer 1945, had defined fundamental principles for Germany: total demilitarization, systematic denazification, political decentralization, and gradual democratization. Division of country into 4 occupation zones and imposition of war reparations, with emphasis on industrial resource transfers toward Soviet Union, were also agreed. However, economic coordination mechanisms were not resolved. which opened constant friction space. Approach differences became more visible between 1946 and 1947. In Soviet zone, centralized economy was established with industry nationalization and agrarian reform through expropriations. In Western zones, market economy was reactivated and private companies were rehabilitated. War reparations were another tension point. Soviet Union demanded massive machinery transfers from Western zones, while United States and United Kingdom prioritized economic recovery of their territory to avoid political instability. In Berlin, located entirely in Soviet zone but divided into 4 sectors, these differences were reflected with intensity. Practical coordination became increasingly difficult. Soviets applied radical purging and profound economic reforms, while Westerners maintained more moderate policies. City joint administration was carried out through Allied Kommandatura, in theory unanimity organ, but in practice marked by continuous blockages. Functional separation intensified. In 1946, United States and United Kingdom merged their zones in Bizonia. In 1948, France joined, forming Trizonia. There, monetary reforms and coordinated reconstruction plans with external support were implemented. In contrast, Soviet zone consolidated planned economy and political system dominated by Socialist Unity Party of Germany, created in 1946 through forced fusion of communists and social democrats. Deutsche Mark, introduction in June 1948 in Trizonia, symbolized definitive rupture. Soviet Union responded with total Berlin blockade that extended until May 1949, seeking to force Western withdrawal from city. Berliners lived under different administrative regimes according to sector. In Eastern nationalizations, political purges and strict police control were applied. In Western sectors, despite scarcity, greater administrative autonomy was maintained and links with Bizonia were strengthened. In 1946, elections to Berlin Magistrat gave clear triumph to Social Democratic Party throughout city. Nevertheless, in Eastern sector pressure to merge Social Democrats in Socialist Unity Party progressively weakened democratic representativeness. In Western sectors, Social Democratic Party maintained its independence, thus consolidating internal political division of city between single party in East and limited pluralism in West. By 1949, separation was consummated. In May, Western zones proclaimed Federal Republic of Germany with provisional capital in Bonn. In October, Soviet zone responded with creation of German Democratic Republic with capital in East Berlin. Berlin, formerly still under Inter-Allied Occupation Statute, became physical and symbolic epicenter of German division. Its western sectors remained linked to Federal Republic, while eastern sector integrated into Democratic Republic. City was already divided into 2 irreconcilable projects, though the wall that would later physically separate it did not yet exist.